Welcome. What you are about to hear is not a quick summary, and it is not a sermon. It is a guided walk through the Bible as a historical library, written across centuries, shaped by empires, carried by real communities, and preserved by hands that believed these words could hold the weight of the world. If you find this kind of careful, source-grounded storytelling valuable, consider subscribing, because this is a long journey, and we're going to take it slowly. The Bible begins where ancient peoples often began, not with arguments, but with origins. In the world of the ancient Near East, creation stories were never merely about physics. They were about identity, order, and authority, about why the world is arranged the way it is, and why humans must live within limits. In that environment, Israel's opening words are both familiar and startling. Familiar because they speak into a cultural landscape where chaos is imagined as a real force, and the gods are often locked in rivalry. Startling because they refuse the rivalries. They strip the cosmos of a divine family feud and present creation as an act of will that does not cost the Creator anything. Light appears before the sun. Land emerges as if it is being assigned a place rather than being fought for. The sea is not a god to appease, but a boundary to be named. This is not an accident of style. It is a quiet revolution. In many neighboring myths, the sea is a hostile deity, and creation is what happens after the gods win a war. Here, the waters are simply waters. They are real, they are dangerous, but they are not ultimate. That difference matters because it sets the Bible's foundation. The world is not ruled by competing powers who can be bribed or tricked. The world has a moral center. The first humans are described in terms that sound royal. The language of image and likeness echoes an older political idea. Kings were often described as the images of gods, living symbols of divine rule. In this text, that status is extended outward. Not just one figure wearing a crown, but humanity as a whole is framed with dignity and responsibility. The human vocation is not to escape the earth, but to steward it, to name, to tend, to cultivate, to protect. The garden is not merely a pretty setting. It is a model of ordered life, a sanctuary-like space where work is meaningful and boundaries are protective rather than oppressive. And then the story introduces a tree. In ancient literature, sacred trees often mark the meeting place between the human and divine, between the known and the forbidden. Here, the tree is not magical in the fairy tale sense. It is moral. It is an embodied boundary. And boundaries are one of the Bible's earliest arguments. Life flourishes when limits are honored. A command is given, not because knowledge is evil, but because autonomy without wisdom is dangerous. The serpent enters without biography. It is not explained like a character in a modern novel. It speaks like a voice that already lives inside the human mind. Suspicion, resentment, the hunger to reinterpret reality. It does not say, hate God. It says something subtler. God is withholding. This is how temptation works in the Bible's psychology. It is a shift in perception before it becomes a shift in action. The world is reframed. The command is reframed. The Creator is reframed as a rival. The act itself is quick. The consequences are slow. Shame appears immediately, and with it the instinct to cover, to hide, to manage the self by fabricating a surface. Fear appears, and with it the urge to retreat from relationship. Blame appears, and with it the fracturing of trust. A man against a woman, humans against the Creator. The creation itself becoming a contested space. The punishment language is not simply retribution. It reads like the unveiling of what a world without trust feels like. Work becomes heavy. Desire becomes complicated. Relationships become strained by power. The ground resists. Life becomes a place where survival competes with meaning. Exile follows. The human pair is driven eastward, away from the garden's sacred space. In biblical geography, east often becomes a direction of loss. The story places a guardian at the entrance. Cherubim, creatures associated elsewhere with divine thrones and sacred boundaries. This is not merely mythic decoration. It is a statement. The world is still under divine rule, but access to the center is no longer uncomplicated. The boundary is now enforced, not because the Creator hates the humans, but because immortality in a corrupted state would turn tragedy into a permanent condition. The next scenes narrow to a family. Two brothers, a sacrifice, an unspoken jealousy, and then the first murder. The text does not romanticize early humanity. It shows violence as both personal and contagious, a force that grows when it is not checked. Cain's anger is described as something that crouches, something that desires. The Bible speaks of sin as if it is a predatory presence, and at the same time it never removes human responsibility. Cain is warned. He is invited to master it. He refuses. And yet even here, the narrative refuses simplicity. Cain is punished, but also marked, protected from immediate vengeance. This detail is often missed. The Bible's earliest moral landscape is not tidy. It does not present justice as pure destruction. It presents justice as limitation and mercy as restraint, even when the offender is guilty. The story becomes wider again. Genealogies appear, not as boring lists, but as a way to show memory. In the ancient world, genealogy is identity. It is belonging. It is the architecture of meaning across generations. Embedded in these lines are two contrasting trajectories: the spread of culture and the spread of violence. Cities are founded, music is made, tools are forged, and threats intensify. A man boasts of vengeance. Power begins to speak in the language of domination. Then the text pauses to deliver a sentence that feels like grief. The earth is filled with corruption, and human imagination tends toward evil. Modern readers sometimes stumble here because the language is sweeping. But in ancient rhetoric, this is the way you describe a world that has crossed a threshold. Violence is no longer an episode. It has become an atmosphere. The flood narrative arrives in a region where flood memories already existed. Mesopotamian literature contains famous flood stories, including one preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh and another in Atrahasis. These texts describe gods who regret humanity because humans are noisy or inconvenient. The biblical account borrows recognizable elements: an ark, a righteous survivor, animals, a deluge, a landing, a sacrifice, yet transforms their moral meaning. Here, the flood is not divine annoyance. It is a response to injustice. It is framed as a kind of decreation, the undoing of order, because the ordered world has become a stage for predation. Noah is introduced not as a hero of conquest, but as a man who walks with God. He builds not a tower, but a refuge. The ark becomes a moving boundary against chaos, a floating remnant of creation's original order. When the waters recede, the language echoes creation again. Dry land appears. Life emerges. Blessing is spoken. The narrative is telling you that history is not just time passing. It is moral weather. The same forces that shaped the first beginning now attempt a second. But the second beginning is not naive. The flood does not erase the human condition. Almost immediately, The story shows Noah's vulnerability, family shame, and the persistence of fracture. The point is not to produce a flawless ancestor. The point is to show that catastrophe can interrupt violence, but it cannot heal the human heart by force. Then comes a covenant, a sign in the sky, a bow, an ancient weapon turned upward as if hung on the clouds. The image is subtle but potent. The divine pledge is not only to judge, but also to restrain judgment. The earth is given a kind of stability, seasons and rhythms that will endure even with human failure present. This is one of the Bible's most important early claims. The world remains livable by promise, not by human virtue. Humanity multiplies again, and with it returns the oldest temptation, to secure permanence through self-made sacred space. A city rises, and in it a tower. In Mesopotamia, great temple towers, ziggurats, served as places where heaven and earth were imagined to meet, where the divine could be invited down. The biblical story does not mock architecture. It critiques motive. The builders want a name. They want security without vulnerability. They want unity without humility. Their project is not simply technological, it is theological. It is an attempt to control the conditions of meaning. The response is not lightning from the sky. It is confusion, language fracture, scattering, the collapse of totalizing control. The story suggests that forced uniformity is not the same as peace, and that human power tends toward empire even when it speaks the language of community. The scattering becomes the seedbed for the next movement of the Bible. Instead of gathering all nations under one human-made tower, the narrative will choose one family and, through them, imagine blessing for many peoples. That pivot is the hinge. It happens quietly. A name appears, Abram, and the Bible's direction changes from universal origins to particular history. The story will move from the wide sky to a dusty road, from cosmic beginnings to a voice that calls a man out of his familiar world. But before that journey begins, the opening chapters have already established the Bible's enduring vocabulary. Sacred space and exile, boundary and desire, blessing and fracture, judgment and restraint. And beneath all of it, a claim that never stops pressing on the reader. The world is not random, and the human struggle is not invisible. Meaning is contested territory. And the Bible, from its first breath, treats that contest as the real story of history. In the ancient world, people did not imagine faith as a private mood. Faith was geography. It was where you pitched your tent, which gods you fed, which borders you trusted, which names you dared to speak when the night wind moved through the reeds. The biblical story turns from cosmic beginnings to a man and a household, because this is how history actually moves, not as an idea, but as a family line, a set of remembered promises, a trail of footprints pressed into dust. Abram appears in the tradition as a migrant from the great riverlands, a person formed by city life yet called away from it. This is not a romantic escape. It is a dismantling. The early narratives carry the texture of a world where survival depends on kinship and hospitality, where strangers can be angels or predators, where the land itself can be both gift and threat. A household is not just a household. It is labor, livestock, servants, alliances, inheritance disputes, and a fragile future that could vanish with one famine season. The call that reaches Abram is presented with a simplicity that feels almost severe. Leave, go, trust. There is no detailed map, no timeline, no argument. The promise is land, descendants, and blessing that does not stop at one tribe. In an era where gods were local and territorial, Tied to specific mountains and city temples, the claim is radical. The one who calls is not bound to a shrine. This God travels. This God speaks in wilderness and in foreign places. Covenant is portable. Abram walks into Canaan and begins doing what ancient people did when they believed a place mattered. He marks it. Altars appear in the story like stakes driven into the ground, statements made in stone and ash. He moves between oaks and hills, near springs and ridgelines. The narrative does not linger on architecture, because the earliest stage of Israel's memory is not a temple story. It is a tent story. It is nomadic, uncertain, and repeatedly interrupted by hunger. Famine drives the household down toward Egypt, because famine did that in the ancient Levant. It pushed people toward river systems and granaries, toward stronger states with stored grain and administrative power. The text shows not only the vulnerability of migrants, but the moral compromises that can follow. Abram becomes afraid. Identity becomes negotiable. Power differentials shape behavior. The Bible does not pretend its ancestors were morally polished. It records their fear because fear is part of the human archive. Back in the land, the household expands, and with expansion comes conflict. Herds compete for pasture. Workers clash. The promise is vast, but the ground underfoot is limited. When Abram and Lot separate, the scene feels like a quiet political moment. Territories are chosen, futures divided. Lot settles near cities. Abram stays among hills and open spaces. The contrast is not simply rural versus urban. It is the moral tension between security and exposure, between settled power and wandering dependence. Then the story introduces a pattern that will return for centuries. The weak are swallowed by the ambitions of the strong. Regional kings raid and capture. People become property. Abram responds not as a solitary mystic, but as a clan leader, forming a rescue with trained men. The text preserves a memory of small-scale warfare that fits the world it describes. Local coalitions, raids, alliances, the constant risk that one's life could be rearranged by a distant conflict. In the aftermath, a priest-king appears briefly, blessing Abram in the name of the Most High. The scene is small, but the implications are large. It hints at a religious landscape where titles and divine names overlap, where worship is not yet centralized, where the language used for God can intersect with broader West Semitic religious vocabulary, while the narrative steadily pushes toward a distinct identity. The Bible is not embarrassed by the complexity of origins. It works through it. A covenant ceremony follows, and the atmosphere shifts. Ancient treaties were sealed in blood and ritual. Animals were cut. Oaths were spoken. Curses were implied. The one who swore promised consequences upon himself if he broke the pledge. In the biblical scene, Abram is placed into a deep, unsettling darkness, and the divine presence passes through the pieces. The moment reads like a treaty, yet the weight falls strangely. The promise is guaranteed not by Abram's strength, but by the God who binds himself to his own word. This is not a contract between equals. It is a pledge from a superior to a fragile human being. The promise, however, does not remove time. Years pass. Bodies age. The most dangerous enemy of faith is not always persecution. It is delay. The story allows that pressure to be felt. Human solutions emerge: surrogacy, household politics, resentment. Hagar becomes a figure of both vulnerability and divine attention, and her encounter in the wilderness is one of the text's sharpest statements about the divine character. The God of the story sees those who are easily erased. When the covenant is marked in flesh through circumcision, the symbolism is intimate and irreversible. It is not a private badge, it is a generational inscription. In cultures where identity is carried through bloodlines, this mark asserts that the promise is not merely spiritual, it is embodied. It will pass through birth, through pain, through the ordinary continuity of life. Then comes the most famous impossible birth in the ancestral narratives, a child promised to an elderly couple. The laughter of Sarah is preserved because disbelief is part of realism. The Bible repeatedly records people responding to divine claims with reactions that sound like actual human voices: confusion, sarcasm, fear, bargaining. The child's name becomes a memorial of that laughter, as if the story wants to keep the emotional truth intact. Soon after, the narrative turns toward a city remembered for its violence and corruption. The tradition depicts messengers arriving in human form, testing the moral fabric of a community through the ancient code of hospitality. In a world without police systems and safe inns, hospitality was not courtesy, it was survival ethics. The threat of sexual violence in the story is not decoration. It is a picture of social collapse, a society where the vulnerable are consumed and the public square becomes predatory. The judgment that falls is framed not as divine temper tantrum, but as consequence upon a place that has normalized cruelty. Lot's escape is messy. The survivors carry trauma, confusion, and shame. The text refuses to give the listener a clean moral aftertaste. It presents a world in which escape does not automatically purify, where even rescued people can become sources of further tragedy. And then the story narrows again to one child, one line, one future that seems too thin to carry the weight of the promise. The binding of Isaac arrives like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. The God who has forbidden chaos now asks for what sounds like the return of chaos. The scene has long disturbed readers because it should. In the ancient Near East, child sacrifice existed in various forms and contexts, contested and condemned in different times and places. The biblical story confronts that world directly, not by ignoring the practice, but by staging a moment where the logic of sacrifice is taken to its limit and then halted. The narrative is not teaching that human sacrifice is acceptable. It is doing something sharper. It is exposing the horror and then insisting that the God of this covenant does not ultimately desire it. A substitute is provided. The knife does not fall. The promise survives, but it survives through dread, not ease. This is the Bible's method. It does not build faith out of comfort. It builds it out of survival, obedience, protest, and the strange mercy that interrupts the worst outcome. Isaac's story continues with quieter tensions. Wells contested, neighbors wary, blessings negotiated. Water rights were life rights. Wells were not romantic, they were political. Disputes over them carry the logic of the land itself: scarcity, ownership, survival. Marriages are arranged within kin networks, not for romance but for continuity. The future is fragile enough that it must be protected through social strategy. The next generation arrives with twins, and the household becomes a theater of rivalry. The text describes the father's preference, the mother's calculation, and the son's struggle for inheritance. In the ancient world, the firstborn status was more than sentiment. It shaped land, labor, leadership, and the family's survival. When Jacob acquires the blessing through deception, the story does not present it as admirable. It presents it as real. People seize what they fear losing, and the consequences ripple outward. Jacob flees into the open spaces that the story has always treated as spiritually charged. In the night, he dreams of a connection between heaven and earth, not built by bricks, but revealed by grace. The dream carries a central biblical reversal. Sacred space is not always a location you control. Sometimes it is a place you stumble upon in exile. Jacob wakes and names the place House of God, and the naming is significant because it turns raw ground into remembered meaning. His years in the household of Laban are a lesson in mirrored deception. The trickster is tricked. Wages are manipulated. Marriages are arranged and rearranged. Children become symbols in a struggle between sisters. The narrative portrays domestic life with a starkness that feels almost modern. Love mixed with rivalry, longing mixed with strategy, blessing mixed with bitterness. Yet within this tangled human fabric, the promise continues, not because the people are noble, but because the covenant is stubborn. Jacob's return is heavy with fear. He expects Esau's vengeance. He prepares gifts, divides his camp, calculates survival. And then, alone at night near a river crossing, he wrestles with a mysterious figure until dawn. The text refuses to make the opponent fully clear in ordinary terms. It is described as a man, yet Jacob will speak of seeing God. This ambiguity is not a literary flaw. It is theology in motion. The story insists that transformation often comes through struggle that cannot be reduced to pure psychology or pure myth. Jacob is wounded. He is renamed. His identity becomes a scar and a title. Israel is born not as a triumphant empire name, but as a word carved out of conflict. When Jacob meets Esau, the reconciliation is tense and fragile. Not every ancient feud ends in blood. Sometimes it ends in a cautious embrace that still leaves distance afterward. The Bible preserves that realism. It does not pretend that forgiveness erases memory overnight. Then the focus shifts again, unexpectedly, to a son sold into slavery by his own brothers. Joseph's story is one of the Bible's most detailed windows into the social world of antiquity. Family betrayal, caravan trade routes, slavery, household administration, prisons, and the machinery of a state that can elevate a foreigner for its own purposes. Dreams appear not as whimsical mysticism, but as a cultural language. Ancient societies treated dreams as meaningful, sometimes as messages, sometimes as omens, sometimes as psychological disturbances. The biblical text uses dreams as a narrative engine while still grounding the consequences in real systems. Contracts, accusations, power, hunger. Joseph's descent is steep. He is stripped, sold, falsely accused, imprisoned. His rise is equally steep, but it does not happen through magic. It happens through competence, patience, and the strange intersection of personal gifts with institutional need. Famine threatens the region, and states with storage systems become centers of gravity. People come to buy grain. Families travel. The story ties private sin to public crisis. Betrayal in a household becomes entangled with survival of nations. When Joseph's brothers arrive, the tension is thick with moral accounting. Joseph tests them, not for entertainment, but to see whether they remain the same men who once sold a brother and then lived comfortably with the lie. The question is not simply whether they regret it. The question is whether they have changed. Judah's willingness to offer himself as a substitute becomes a turning point. In this family, the promise begins to take a particular shape. Survival will be purchased through substitution, through someone stepping forward to bear what another deserves. Reunion follows, but it is not sentimental. It is survival-driven. Jacob's household moves into Egypt, into a land of abundance and foreign gods, into the shadow of a state with immense power. The text does not hide the danger. Refuge can become captivity. Protection can become dependence. And the Bible places the family there like a seed buried in dark soil, alive but vulnerable, waiting for a future that has not yet revealed its cost. Jacob blesses his sons with words that sound like poetry and prophecy, yet they also function like a family constitution. Tribes will emerge, roles will harden, conflicts will be inherited. The ancestral era closes not with a palace, but with a coffin, not with triumph, but with a promise carried forward. The story is not finished, and the land is not forgotten, even when the people live far from it. The Bible's earliest history, in other words, is not the tale of perfect saints. It is the record of a covenant moving through ordinary human darkness, through hunger and migration, rivalry and reconciliation, fear and endurance, until a family becomes a people, and a people becomes the stage on which the next crisis will unfold. Egypt in the biblical imagination is not simply a location. It is an engine, fertile, glittering, administratively brilliant, and spiritually crowded. The Nile does not just water fields, it organizes reality. Seasons arrive on schedule, crops rise, taxes flow, temples breathe incense, and the state learns to measure human life the way it measures grain. In such a world, power is not an abstract idea. It has names, storehouses, foremen, quotas, whips, ledgers, and officials who can turn a family into a labor unit with a single command. The story places Israel's ancestors there as guests who slowly become a problem. One generation is tolerated, the next is watched. Then fear takes over, and fear is always looking for a policy. The text describes forced labor and brickmaking, a life reduced to production. In the ancient Near East, corvée labor, state-imposed work, was common, and foreigners or marginal groups could be especially vulnerable. The narrative's point is not to give a modern legal definition of slavery. It is to show what happens when a government decides that a minority's growth is a threat to national stability. Oppression, in this telling, is not only physical, it is spiritual suffocation. When a people is crushed long enough, memory itself begins to fray. Names fade, stories blur. Hope becomes dangerous because it keeps a person awake at night. Into that pressure, the story introduces a child. A baby placed in the reeds is one of those images that feels symbolic and yet is rooted in a world where desperate parents did desperate things. The Nile can be a giver of life and a taker of life. The basket is a fragile invention against an enormous system, a small defiance sealed with pitch. The child survives, and the irony is sharp. He is raised within the very household connected to the machinery of oppression. He learns language, ritual etiquette, hierarchies, and the heavy confidence of empire. Yet his identity remains divided, and division is where conscience often begins. When he sees brutality and reacts with violence, the story does not excuse him. It shows him as human, angered, impulsive, shaken by what he cannot unsee. His flight into the wilderness is not a heroic retreat. It is the collapse of the double life. In the deserts beyond Egypt's cultivated order, the world becomes sparse. Stone, wind, thorn scrub, and night skies too large to ignore. There, among pastoral communities, he becomes something the palace did not train: patient. He marries, works with animals, learns the slow time of nomads. The wilderness strips away the illusion that power is permanent. Then comes the moment the tradition never treats as ordinary. A fire that burns without consuming is not offered as a parlor trick. It arrives as a sign that the holy is not merely stronger than nature, but different in kind. In ancient religion, divine presence was often localized. tied to statues, temples, and sacred precincts. Here, presence appears in a lonely place to an exile who owns nothing. The ground becomes sacred, not because humans built something impressive upon it, but because the divine claims it. The voice that speaks does not begin with an abstract philosophy. It begins with suffering. It speaks of hearing cries, seeing affliction, remembering covenant. When the divine name is revealed, the language resists being pinned down. It sounds like being itself, like a refusal to be controlled by human labels. In a world where invoking a god's name could be treated as a way to harness that god, this revelation does the opposite. It grants intimacy without granting possession. It says, in effect, that the one who sends will not be reduced to a tool of any state, tribe, or magician. The confrontation with Pharaoh is therefore not only political, it is theological combat by other means. Pharaoh is more than a man. He is the living symbol of a worldview where the ruler is entangled with the divine order of the land. When Moses speaks, it is not merely a demand for better working conditions. It is a demand that undermines Pharaoh's claim to ultimate authority over bodies, time, and worship. The plagues, whatever one makes of their exact historical mechanics, function in the narrative as a systematic dismantling of Egypt's sacred securities. Water turns unreliable. The boundary between clean and unclean collapses. Animals, fields, and human skin become sites of disorder. Darkness falls not as poetry, but as an assault on the confidence of a civilization built on predictable light and predictable cycles. Each blow declares that what Egypt treats as stable is not invincible. The Hebrew God is not another local deity to be placed on a shelf alongside others. This is not an argument made in a council chamber. It is made in the bodies of people, in the smell of ruined crops, in the tremor of households that realize they cannot protect themselves. At the heart of the departure is a meal. The Passover narrative binds liberation to ritual memory, as if the text wants to ensure that freedom will never be reduced to politics alone. The details are intimate. Families gathered, bread made without time to let it rise, bitter herbs recalling bitterness, the posture of readiness. Blood on doorways is a sign that has provoked centuries of interpretation. In its ancient context, marking a threshold is not strange. Doorways and lintels were liminal spaces, places where protection rituals could cluster. Here, the mark becomes a declaration of belonging under divine claim. The night is described as a night of judgment, and the story insists that Egypt's power is not merely challenged, it is wounded at the core. When the people leave, the tradition emphasizes haste and confusion alongside awe. Freedom begins as movement before it becomes understanding. A crowd in motion is not automatically a nation. It is a mass of bodies carrying dough, bundles, crying children, elderly parents, and the sharp fear that the state might change its mind. And the state does. The pursuit scene is one of the Bible's earliest pictures of empire's reflex. When labor leaves, power panics. The escape through the sea is presented in language that echoes creation again. Waters divided, boundaries imposed, dry ground appearing where it should not. For ancient listeners, the sea is the great symbol of untamed threat. The story's claim is that the same power that ordered the world can order the sea. Deliverance is portrayed as the defeat of chaos, not only the defeat of an army. On the other side, celebration erupts, and it erupts with a warning embedded inside it. The first song is not a song about human strength. It is a song about divine action. The narrative is careful here, because it knows how easily a liberated people can become self-worshipping. The wilderness, however, is not a clean hallway from slavery to peace. It is a proving ground. Food becomes a daily crisis. Water becomes an argument. Former slaves carry the habits of slavery inside their imagination, and when fear returns, they start to romanticize what once killed them. This is one of the Bible's sharpest psychological observations. A person can hate captivity and still miss its predictability. Freedom is heavy because it requires trust, and trust is risky when you have been crushed by authorities you could not resist. The text describes manna not just as provision, but as discipline. It arrives with limits. Take enough, not more. Do not hoard. Learn daily dependence. In economic terms, it is anti-empire. Egypt's power was expressed in storage and quotas, in controlling time and supply. The wilderness provision teaches a different economy, one that refuses both panic hoarding and exploitative accumulation. The weekly rhythm of rest pushes in the same direction. Time itself becomes sacred. A day without production becomes a protest against Pharaoh's world. Then the people come to a mountain. Mountains in the ancient world often signify encounter with the divine, places where heaven feels closer and humans feel smaller. At Sinai, the narrative becomes dense with covenant language. This is where liberation is given moral shape. The law is not introduced as a ladder to earn rescue. It is introduced after rescue, as the structure meant to keep a rescued people from recreating Egypt among themselves. The core commands are brief and severe. They speak about allegiance, about the danger of making images, about the weight of the divine name, about sacred time, about honoring parents, about murder, adultery, theft, false testimony, and the secret violence of coveting. It is not merely a private morality list. It is a social architecture designed to prevent community life from collapsing into predation. Many ancient law collections existed in the wider Near Eastern world, and they often aimed at stability and justice within a stratified society. The biblical law shares certain legal forms, yet insists, again and again, that the vulnerable are not expendable. Foreigners, widows, orphans, debtors. The covenant is sealed with ritual, and the people consent, at least with their mouths. But the story knows that consent is fragile. The golden calf episode is not simply a tale about ancient idolatry. It is about fear of absence. When Moses remains on the mountain, uncertainty spreads. People want something visible, something manageable, something they can carry and control. The calf evokes fertility imagery and the iconography of strength common in the region. It is not random. It is a return to a religious instinct shaped by the surrounding world. If the divine is invisible, make it visible. If leadership is delayed, manufacture certainty. The narrative treats the act as a breach, not because art is evil, but because the covenant was about relationship, and relationship cannot survive if one party turns the other into an object. The crisis that follows is violent, full of grief and hard decisions. The Bible does not pretend that spiritual betrayal is consequence-free. It portrays communal rupture as real damage, the kind that requires costly repair. And yet, after judgment, there is renewal. Moses intercedes. The language becomes daring, the servant arguing for the people, pleading on the basis of divine character, appealing to mercy without denying justice. The tradition presents this as a defining revelation. The God of Israel is not merely powerful. This God is committed, capable of compassion, slow to anger, steadfast in loyal love, and yet unwilling to call evil harmless. From there, instructions for a sanctuary appear, but it is not a palace built to impress nations. It is a portable dwelling, a tent of meeting that can move with the people. In the ancient world, temples signaled a god's territorial claim and a king's legitimacy. Here, the sanctuary signals something different: presence traveling with a community that has no permanent land yet, presence choosing to live among those who were once treated as disposable labor. The story ends this movement with a profound reversal of Egypt. In Egypt, the people built storehouses for a god-king who demanded endless production. In the wilderness, they build a dwelling for the god who liberated them, and the building is framed as voluntary offering rather than coerced quota. The same hands that once shaped bricks under threat now shape a sanctuary in hope. The transformation is incomplete. The people are still unstable, but a new center has been planted in their imagination. Not Pharaoh, not fear, not the weight of whips. Presence, covenant, and a holiness that does not feed on human suffering. Holiness, in the Bible's earliest law, is not presented as a private emotion. It is presented as an environment, a way of arranging space, time, food, sex, debt, disease, worship, leadership, so that a rescued people does not slowly rebuild the very cruelty it escaped. The portable sanctuary becomes the nerve center of that environment. Not because the divine needs housing, but because humans need a center that is not an idol and not an empire. Sacred space in this tradition is carefully layered. There are courts and curtains, basins and altars, thresholds that teach a lesson every time a person approaches. Access is real, but it is not casual. Nearness is offered, but it is not seized. Priests appear not as mystical superheroes, but as ritual technicians and guardians of boundaries. In the ancient world, temples were economic hubs. Sacrifice was not merely religious. It was a system that connected food, wealth, purity, and social stability. The Bible places that reality under moral pressure. It treats offerings as meaningful, but it never allows them to replace justice. Blood in this world is not a horror prop. It is a symbol of life, and therefore a symbol of cost. If life is sacred, then reconciliation cannot be cheap. If wrongdoing damages a community, then repair must be tangible. The sacrificial system in these texts reads like a language. Some offerings are about gratitude. Some are about repairing breaches. Some acknowledge that humans carry impurity simply by living in vulnerable bodies. Purity here is often misunderstood by modern readers because it can sound like moral judgment when it is not always that. In many cases, it functions more like ritual status. Clean and unclean as categories that protect the sanctuary from becoming casual, that keep death and disorder from being normalized in the center of communal life. Childbirth, skin disease, bodily emissions, contact with corpses, these are not treated as sins in themselves. They are treated as reminders that mortality is real. The community's worship is structured around the fact that human life is beautiful and fragile and constantly brushing against decay. One day stands out with particular force: the day when the sanctuary is symbolically cleansed, when accumulated communal impurity is addressed, when wrongdoing is acknowledged publicly rather than hidden. A live animal becomes a carrier of confessed burdens and is sent away into the wilderness. The drama is unmistakable. The people are forced to imagine evil not as a private stain, but as a load that must be removed from the camp if life together is to remain possible. The wilderness, which has always represented danger and chaos, becomes the place where disorder is returned, not fed, not enthroned, but expelled. And yet the texts are blunt about a painful truth. Even with holy architecture, even with rituals and laws, people do not become stable simply because they have been rescued. Liberation does not erase impulse, it reveals it. The wilderness narratives show a community oscillating between awe and suspicion. Thirst becomes accusation. Hunger becomes nostalgia for captivity. Leadership becomes a target. The story records complaints with an almost uncomfortable honesty because it is documenting how groups fracture when fear returns. A freed people can still think like slaves. They can still crave a strong man. They can still interpret uncertainty as abandonment. At times, the rebellion is loud, public, almost political. Challenges to leadership, rival claimants, movements that want to reshape authority. At other times, it is quieter and more corrosive. The slow drift into practices borrowed from surrounding cultures. The blending of worship with convenience. The attempt to keep the divine while rewriting the covenant's demands. The narrative treats these moments not as minor lapses, but as existential tests. A people can survive scarcity. They may not survive cynicism. The consequence the story emphasizes is delay. Not simply punishment in the narrow sense, but a kind of wilderness extension. An entire generation living in the gap between promise and possession. The Bible's anthropology here is severe. Habits formed under oppression do not die quickly. They take time, and they often die only with the people who first carried them. New life in a new land requires a new interior world. As the community approaches the edge of settlement, the tone of the tradition shifts. The speeches attributed to Moses read like covenant renewal, like a final shaping of memory before the people step into a contested landscape. Scholars often note that the covenant language resembles treaty forms known in the ancient Near East. A preamble identifying the sovereign, a historical reminder of what has been done. Stipulations, blessings for loyalty, curses for betrayal, witnesses, and a call to keep the document. The Bible uses familiar diplomatic structures, but fills them with a striking moral claim. The sovereign is not a human emperor. The covenant is not a tool to extract tribute for a palace. It is meant to restrain power, protect the vulnerable, and keep worship from becoming a mask for exploitation. This is where the law becomes intensely social. Care for the foreigner is repeated, not as sentimental charity, but as national identity. Remember what it was to be powerless. Debt is treated as dangerous because it can quietly turn neighbors into property. Courts are warned against bribes because justice collapses not only through open violence, but through small corruptions that become normal. Even kings, when they later appear in Israel's imagination, are anticipated with suspicion. A ruler must not multiply wealth, must not multiply instruments of war, must not multiply bodies for pleasure as though humans were trophies. The covenant attempts to limit the oldest human fantasy. That authority means the right to consume. Then comes the entry into the land, and the text becomes both grounded and contested. The traditions describe crossings, encounters, battles, and the fall of fortified sites. The narrative voice is confident, but the historical questions are complex. Archaeology shows a region with shifting populations, collapsed cities, new settlements, and a landscape shaped by the rise and fall of larger empires. Some models emphasize sudden conquest. Others emphasize gradual infiltration and social transformation among local Canaanite populations. Still others point to the possibility of multiple processes over time. Conflict in some areas, assimilation in others, political collapse creating openings, and rural communities forming new identities. The Bible's own memory may preserve more than one layer. Heroic episodes, older songs, tribal traditions, later theological framing. What remains clear is that the land is portrayed as both gift and moral test. It is not handed over as a trophy for superiority. it is presented as a trust. The land itself is described as capable of reacting to injustice, as if the environment will not indefinitely tolerate predation. This is a profound biblical theme. Geography has ethics. Soil and stone become witnesses. The conquest traditions also force readers to confront the Bible's most difficult portrayals of violence. The texts sometimes use absolute language, the rhetoric of total removal, which resembles ancient war accounts that often speak in hyperbole to declare decisive victory even when populations remained. At the same time, the moral discomfort cannot be waved away with a technical note. The Bible itself contains internal tension on this point. It celebrates deliverance from oppression, yet records commands and actions that sound like severe judgment upon societies described as deeply violent and exploitative. The tradition seems to be grappling with a world where cruelty was normal and survival often meant conflict, while insisting that the God of Israel is not simply baptizing human aggression. This tension sits inside the library, unresolved in the easy way modern audiences often demand, because the Bible is not a polished manifesto. It is a record of a people wrestling with holiness in a brutal ancient world. Once the initial entry narratives pass, the next reality appears. Settlement is not stability. Tribes spread across hills and valleys, living near older city-states, navigating alliances, rivalries, and the constant pressure of better-armed neighbors. The picture that emerges is a loose confederation rather than a centralized kingdom. Leadership is episodic, arising in crisis, fading in quiet seasons. The judges are not crowned monarchs. They are deliverers, war leaders, negotiators, sometimes deeply flawed, sometimes courageous, often both at once. This period is marked by cycles that feel like social anthropology: drift, oppression, outcry, deliverance, temporary peace, drift again. The texts do not attribute every hardship to simple moral failure, but they do insist that spiritual compromise has social consequences. When worship is bent toward convenience, justice bends too. When sacred boundaries are treated as negotiable, the weak pay the price first. The stories of the judges are not comfortable hero tales. They include vows that should never have been spoken, violence that bleeds into domestic life, tribal feuds that nearly erase entire communities, and moments where the line between deliverer and tyrant becomes thin. The narrative seems determined to show that charisma is not the same as righteousness, and that leadership without covenant restraint becomes another form of oppression. In the background, certain institutions begin to grow. Local sanctuaries become focal points. Priestly families hold influence. Prophetic voices appear as moral disruptors. The ark, symbol of divine presence, moves through communities as both blessing and danger, because sacred things in this tradition are never treated as lucky charms. They demand alignment. And at the edge of these narratives, a dark sentence hangs like a verdict on the era. Everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. It is not written to praise freedom. It is written to diagnose a society without a shared moral center. When every person becomes their own law, the strongest interpretation wins, and the vulnerable are left to hope for mercy that may never come. Still, even here the Bible keeps planting small lights. A foreign woman enters the covenant people through loyalty and survival, showing that belonging is not only blood, but faithfulness. A child is born who will become an ancestor in the line of kings, suggesting that the future will not be built solely by warriors and judges, but also by widows, migrants, farmers, and people whose courage looks like steadfastness rather than conquest. The period ends not with a triumphant state, but with a hunger for coherence. The people want a different kind of stability. They want leadership that does not vanish after each crisis. They want security in a landscape that keeps producing threats. And in that desire, half reasonable, half dangerous, the next transformation of the biblical story begins to gather its force. A people that lives by crisis learns a certain rhythm: fear, reaction, relief, forgetting. It is a rhythm that can keep you alive for a season, but it cannot build a future. In the hill country and valleys of the southern Levant, surrounded by stronger city-states and moving coalitions, the tribes of Israel exist as a loose confederation, bound by memory and worship more than by administration. It is a world of small farms and grazing lands, contested wells, seasonal migrations, and sudden raids that can burn a year of labor in a single night. Over time, the demand for a new kind of stability rises like pressure behind a wall. The tradition does not present this desire as purely sinful or purely noble. It treats it as human. People want their children to sleep without the sound of war horns. They want borders that hold. They want leadership that persists beyond a single deliverer's lifetime. And they look around at neighboring nations and see something that appears to work: a king, a centralized court, an army, a visible symbol of continuity. But the Bible also knows what kings do. In the ancient Near East, monarchy was not only governance, it was theology. The king represented order against chaos. The king was the mediator of divine favor. The king was the one who could demand bodies, grain, and loyalty in the name of national survival. When Israel asks for a king, the narrative hears something deeper than a political request. It hears a spiritual shift, an impulse to trade invisible trust for visible power. The first king emerges out of that tension. Saul is portrayed as physically imposing, chosen, and yet inwardly unstable, like a man wearing a mantle that does not fit his soul. He begins with promise, a leader who can unite the tribes against immediate threats. But the story quickly frames his failure in a particular way. It is not merely that he makes bad strategic decisions. It is that he cannot live under restraint. He cannot accept that even a king is not ultimate. He treats sacred commands as negotiable, and he treats public approval as the real God he must satisfy. The prophetic voice that confronts him is significant. Prophets in this tradition are not fortune-tellers. They are covenant prosecutors, moral auditors who speak as if the nation's relationship with the divine is a legal bond with consequences. Their presence means the monarchy is never allowed to become absolute. Israel may have a king, but the king is watched. The king can be judged. That is rare in ancient royal ideology, where criticism of the sovereign could be treason. Here, criticism becomes a sacred duty. As Saul's reign darkens, the narrative introduces a younger figure whose rise is slow, complicated, and often unwilling. David enters not first as a politician, but as a shepherd and musician, someone shaped by open fields, animal vulnerability, and long hours of solitude. The famous duel with the giant is remembered not simply as a heroic spectacle, but as a conflict of worldviews, armor and intimidation versus trust and agility, a warrior culture versus the audacity of a youth who believes that power is not always what it looks like. Yet the text refuses to let David become a clean symbol. His path is soaked in danger, exile, negotiation, and moral ambiguity. He becomes a fugitive in the wilderness, the same wilderness that once formed Moses, learning the fragility of life outside systems. He gathers marginalized men around him, the desperate and discontent, and the story hints at how political movements are often born. not in palaces, but in caves, among those who have nothing left to lose. Saul's jealousy becomes a case study in how kings can rot from the inside. Fear of losing power turns leadership into paranoia. The king's house becomes unstable. Violence spills outward. Sacred institutions are threatened. The narrative includes episodes where priests are slaughtered and innocence is consumed by the machinery of royal insecurity. These moments are not incidental. They are warnings carved into history. When authority is driven by self-preservation, it will devour what should be protected. David's restraint toward Saul, even when he has opportunity to kill him, is portrayed as a pivotal moral choice. It is not presented as weakness. It is presented as an understanding of legitimacy and the danger of seizing power through blood. The text is showing that the temptation to solve a political crisis through assassination creates a new crisis that does not end. A nation cannot heal if every transfer of authority requires murder. When Saul falls and David eventually takes the throne, Israel's story enters a new phase, from tribal confederation to centralized state. A capital is established. Administrative systems grow. The ark is brought into the center of national life, and this movement is charged with meaning. The sacred is being drawn into the political heart of the people. That can be either covenant faithfulness or dangerous manipulation, depending on the character of those who hold power. The tradition treats David's reign as both apex and warning. He unifies territory, secures borders, and creates a sense of national identity. And then, in one of the Bible's most devastating turns, he uses that power for personal consumption. The story of his sexual exploitation and the arranged death that follows is told without flinching. The language is not written to protect his reputation. It is written to expose the anatomy of abuse. Desire aided by privilege, secrecy managed by authority, a righteous man placed in a trap he cannot escape. A prophet confronts David not with political strategy, but with a story. The parable is a mirror held up to a king who has forgotten what it means to be judged. The confrontation is central to the Bible's moral architecture. It insists that no one, not even the most celebrated leader, stands above accountability. David's repentance is recorded, and so are the consequences. Forgiveness is not portrayed as erasing the damage. It is portrayed as a new relationship with truth, lived under the shadow of what cannot be undone. From that point, the royal household becomes a storm. The text depicts sexual violence within the family, revenge that becomes political rebellion, and a son's attempt to seize the throne. The nation fractures along personal wounds. The king who once fled through wilderness now flees again, older, broken, carrying the bitter knowledge that a ruler can conquer enemies and still lose his own house. The civil conflict that follows is described with grief more than triumph. Even when rebellion is crushed, the victory feels like a funeral. David's lament over his son reveals something rare in ancient war literature. A king allowed to weep openly, a leader who feels the cost of power not only as a public statistic, but as personal devastation. The Bible is not simply documenting who won, it is documenting what winning does to the soul. As David ages, the narrative emphasizes succession anxiety, a familiar feature of ancient monarchies. When legitimacy rests in one person, the person's weakness becomes the nation's vulnerability. Court factions form. Promises are negotiated. The future is contested in whispers, and the kingdom learns that stability purchased through monarchy has its own price. Intrigue, rivalry, and the constant threat of fracture. Solomon rises as the heir whose name becomes synonymous with wisdom. His reign is depicted as a time of wealth, international alliances, and monumental building. The centerpiece is the temple. The temple is not simply a religious building. It is a political and theological statement. It centralizes worship, consolidates national identity, and signals to neighboring states that Israel is now playing the imperial game of prestige and permanence. The temple's design and symbolism are saturated with ancient sacred imagery: guarded thresholds, layered holiness, sacred furnishings, and a focus on purity that reflects the older portable sanctuary while transforming it into a fixed national center. In the biblical portrayal, the temple is meant to declare that the Creator of heaven and earth is not contained by stone, even while allowing a particular place to serve as a focus for prayer and sacrifice. The tradition holds this paradox on purpose. Sacred space matters, but it must never become a cage for the divine. Solomon's wisdom is celebrated, yet the narrative slowly turns critical. Wisdom, in biblical terms, is not mere intelligence. It is moral alignment, the ability to rule without becoming a predator. And Solomon's wealth and alliances come with spiritual gravity. In the ancient world, international marriages were political treaties. They were not just personal relationships, they were statecraft. With them came cultural exchange, religious influence, competing loyalties, and the quiet drift of worship toward convenience. The text portrays Solomon multiplying what the covenant had warned against: luxury, horses, and the expansive appetite that turns a nation's resources into a king's lifestyle. His building projects require labor. Administration requires taxation. The structure of the kingdom begins to resemble the empires Israel once feared: districts, quotas, forced service. The irony is deliberate. The people who were freed from a brick-making regime now find themselves constructing monuments under royal demand. It is not the same as Egypt in every detail, but the pattern echoes loudly enough to be uncomfortable. This is the Bible's political realism. Monarchy can protect a people from external threats while quietly creating internal oppression. Security can be purchased with injustice. Prosperity can anesthetize conscience. A temple can stand like a holy crown while the poor grow heavier under the weight of royal ambition. When Solomon dies, the fracture that has been forming becomes visible. The northern tribes resist the yoke of taxation and forced labor. A new king refuses to lighten the burden, choosing intimidation instead of wisdom. The result is rupture. The kingdom splits. Israel divides into two political entities with competing capitals, competing dynasties, and competing religious centers. From this point onward, the biblical narrative becomes a record of two kingdoms drifting, colliding, and bleeding under the pressure of their own decisions and the larger empires gathering beyond their borders. The split is not just administrative, it is spiritual. Worship becomes entangled with identity politics. Rival shrines are established. Symbols are deployed to secure loyalty. The divine is used as a banner for human power. And yet, even as the state fractures, the Bible's deepest claim continues to pulse underneath. Covenant is not maintained by institutions alone, not by kings, not by palaces, not even by temples. It is maintained by truth, justice, and a stubborn divine commitment that keeps speaking, sometimes through prophets, sometimes through disasters, sometimes through the quiet endurance of people who refuse to let the story die. The age of kings has begun, and with it a new kind of temptation: to believe that if the nation looks strong, it must be well. The next chapters will prove how false that assumption can be. After the kingdom split, the land did not suddenly become empty or silent. Villages still woke to goats bleating in cold dawn air. Farmers still watched the sky for the first rains. Merchants still moved along ridge roads with sacks of grain and dyed cloth. The rupture was political, but its deeper effect was spiritual. The people now had two centers of loyalty, two royal houses competing for legitimacy, and two competing ways to claim that the covenant still held. In the northern kingdom, power was unstable from the beginning. Dynasties rose quickly and ended violently. Capitals shifted, alliances shifted, and survival required constant negotiation with stronger neighbors. The southern kingdom had Davidic continuity and the temple, yet it was not immune to the same disease, the belief that sacred symbols could substitute for moral faithfulness. This is the Bible's hard insistence. Worship can become a mask, and a temple can become a hiding place for injustice. The prophets enter this world like storm fronts. They do not arrive as private mystics. They arrive as public disruptors. Their speech is saturated with the language of treaties and courts, because they are addressing a covenant people as if the relationship with their God is a binding agreement that can be violated, prosecuted, and judged. The prophets speak against kings, priests, merchants, landowners, judges, anyone who turns power into predation. Their message is not primarily that the people need more rituals. It is that the rituals have become dangerous when used to sanitize exploitation. They describe marketplaces where scales are rigged, where debt squeezes families into dependence, where the poor are treated like disposable labor. They describe courts where bribes decide verdicts. They describe worship gatherings where songs are loud and consciences are quiet. This is not merely religious critique, it is social anatomy. The prophets are diagnosing a civilization's bloodstream, how wealth moves, how violence is normalized, how the vulnerable are made invisible. One of the most unsettling themes is their insistence that national collapse will not be an accident of geopolitics alone. They present it as consequence, not simplistic punishment in the sense of lightning bolts, but moral rot producing political weakness. A society that consumes its own poor may look prosperous, but it is hollowed from within. When pressure comes from outside, it will crack. Pressure does come. In the wider world, empires are not abstractions. They are machines. They have standing armies, siege engineers, administrative languages, tribute systems, and rulers who understand that terror can be policy. The Assyrian Empire in particular becomes the great shadow across the Levant. Its inscriptions boast of campaigns, deportations, and the deliberate breaking of resistance through fear. The Bible's narrative of this era matches the reality of imperial practice that archaeology and ancient records preserve. Vassal kings forced into loyalty, tribute demanded, rebellious cities punished, populations moved to prevent future uprisings. For the northern kingdom, these pressures are lethal. Political leaders seek security through alliances and quick fixes. Some look to Egypt for support, drawn by the old dream that the Nile state might counterbalance Mesopotamian might. Others submit and pay tribute, hoping humiliation will purchase survival. Others rebel, and rebellion invites siege. The prophetic critiques during this period are merciless, because the prophets see how desperation can drive moral compromise even deeper. When leaders panic, they often sacrifice the poor first. They seize land, raise taxes, conscript labor, and blame religious minorities or internal enemies to unify the frightened public. The northern kingdom eventually collapses under Assyrian force, and the trauma is more than military defeat. It is dislocation. People are scattered, deported, absorbed into other populations, and their institutions fracture. What survives is memory, songs, stories, warnings, laments, and the bitter realization that identity can be erased not only by sword, but by administrative policy. The Southern Kingdom watches all of this while telling itself a comforting story. We have the temple. We have the chosen city. We have a royal promise. Therefore, we are safe. The prophets attack this illusion with a particular fury. They insist that sacred space does not protect those who practice injustice. They describe the temple as a place turned into a den for people who commit violence and then hide behind prayer. They mock the idea that offerings can buy forgiveness while the oppressed are still bleeding. Yet the Southern Kingdom also experiences moments of remarkable resilience. There are kings remembered for attempts at reform and for resisting foreign domination in complex ways. There are periods when the city holds through siege, when survival feels like evidence of divine mercy. But even these moments carry a dangerous aftertaste. Survival can make people think they were righteous, when they may simply have been spared for reasons beyond their understanding. The prophetic tradition during these years becomes increasingly intense, and it broadens its imagery. The prophets speak in poetry because prose is too small for what they are trying to convey. A nation's soul fracturing, a people misunderstanding their own story, divine presence becoming both comfort and terror. They describe the covenant like a marriage violated, like a body diseased, like a vineyard ruined by its own caretakers. They describe leaders as shepherds who feed themselves while the flock starves. They describe the poor as the true measure of national health, because how a society treats the powerless reveals what it truly worships. Alongside condemnation, however, the prophets also preserve something astonishing: hope that is not sentimental. They envision restoration, but not as a simple return to old politics. They imagine a renewed covenant written inwardly, not merely carved on stone. They imagine a future where justice is not an occasional reform, but a steady river. They imagine that exile and judgment will not be the final shape of the relationship. This hope is never presented as permission to continue wrongdoing. It is presented as a promise that divine commitment is deeper than human failure. As Assyria's dominance eventually falters, a new imperial force rises in the east: Babylon. The political map shifts again, and small kingdoms are forced into the same old dilemma: submit, ally, or rebel. Egypt, weakened and then resurgent in moments, again becomes a tempting partner for rulers seeking leverage. The Southern Kingdom is pulled between empires like a small boat caught between currents. Tribute drains the economy. Court factions argue. Advisors whisper. Priests try to keep worship stable as uncertainty grows. Ordinary people continue planting and harvesting, yet they can feel the ground trembling under the weight of decisions made above them. This is where the Bible's portrayal becomes painfully detailed. It shows leaders making promises to foreign powers and breaking them, swearing loyalty and then plotting revolt. It shows prophets warning that rebellion will bring catastrophe, only to be branded as traitors for speaking the truth. It shows the psychology of denial. People prefer a comfortable prophecy to an honest one, especially when honest words threaten national pride. False assurances spread like perfume in a crowded room, pleasant, intoxicating, and deadly. The conflict between prophetic warning and political ambition becomes central. The prophet is not merely predicting events. The prophet is challenging a worldview. Kings treat the state as ultimate. The prophets treat the covenant as ultimate. Kings believe they can maneuver history through diplomacy and force. The prophets insist that moral reality is not a chessboard. When leaders abandon justice and treat worship as propaganda, The nation becomes vulnerable in ways no alliance can fix. When Babylon finally moves decisively, the experience is not a single dramatic moment. It is a series of humiliations and fractures. Tribute, captivity, and forced submission come first. Then greater violence. Siege is not described as heroic battle, but as slow starvation, the tearing down of normal life. Hunger makes people desperate. Disease follows. Social order collapses under the strain. The city becomes a pressure cooker of fear and prayer and accusation. The temple, the great symbol of permanence, stands at the center of this crisis like a question no one wants to answer. Can it fall? Can the sacred center be destroyed? For many, the thought is unthinkable, because the temple has become not only a house of worship, but a guarantee of meaning. If it can burn, then what else is stable? The prophetic literature refuses to soften the answer. It insists that the temple is not a charm. It can be destroyed if the covenant is treated with contempt. The horror of that claim is part of the lesson. The Bible is pressing its audience toward a terrifying maturity. Faith is not the belief that sacred things make you invulnerable. Faith is the willingness to cling to God even when sacred things are taken away. When destruction comes, it carries a double wound. There is the physical devastation, walls breached, buildings burned, families shattered. And there is the theological devastation, the collapse of a worldview in which divine presence seemed anchored to a single place. Exile is not merely relocation, it is identity crisis. If the God of Israel is truly sovereign, why did the city fall? If the covenant is real, why are the people scattered? The texts do not hide these questions. They preserve them because they were the questions that shaped the next stage of Israel's faith. In the ruins, a new kind of spirituality begins to form, not as a replacement for the old, but as a survival adaptation. Prayer becomes portable. Scripture becomes central in a way it could not be when the temple was everything. Memory becomes an act of resistance. The community learns to keep sacred time without sacred space. It learns to tell its story without a throne. It learns, painfully, that the divine presence it once assumed was guaranteed by architecture must now be sought in obedience, repentance, and hope held with trembling hands. What the prophets leave behind, therefore, is not merely a record of doom. It is a redefinition of what it means to belong to God. They strip away the illusion that nationhood is the same as righteousness. They strip away the fantasy that worship can be separated from justice. They strip away the idol of political strength, and they insist that even when cities burn and institutions collapse, the story is not finished, because the covenant was never meant to be a trophy on a shelf. It was meant to be a fire in the human heart, capable of surviving even in foreign lands, even in grief, even when everything familiar has turned to ash. Exile is a different kind of ruin than conquest. Conquest breaks walls. Exile breaks orientation. In Babylon, the air itself feels foreign. The great river moves with an indifferent patience, carrying silt and boats and the reflections of temples that were never built for Israel's God. Streets hum with languages that do not pronounce the old names the right way. Markets are full, the empire is efficient, and the very normality of it becomes part of the wound. A displaced people learns quickly that grief can be loud at first, and then become quiet, the way a scar becomes part of the body. The biblical tradition preserves the ache through songs and laments that refuse to flatten trauma into a moral lesson. There are voices that remember the city's smoke and beg for justice, and voices that sound like exhausted breathing, asking how to keep praying when everything once considered stable has been torn away. Yet exile also produces something unexpectedly resilient: the discovery that worship can survive without a throne and without a temple. In the older world, sacred life had a center you could point to. Now the center must be carried, not in stone, but in memory, in language, in disciplined practice. The community begins to gather around texts and prayers with new intensity. Sabbath becomes more than rest, it becomes identity. Dietary boundaries become more than habit. They become a daily reminder that belonging is not dictated by empire. Circumcision, already ancient, takes on renewed significance as an embodied refusal to dissolve into the dominant culture. This does not happen as a neat institutional reform. It happens like survival happens, through families, through elders teaching children, through stubborn routines in rented homes, through songs sung quietly so neighbors do not mock them. The deepest shift is theological. If the God of Israel can be worshipped in Babylon, then this God is not confined to a single landscape. The destruction that once looked like the collapse of divine presence becomes, paradoxically, a harsh proof of divine freedom. The tradition also records the experience of living under a sophisticated empire where loyalty is expected not only in taxes, but in gestures of reverence. Court stories portray the pressure to bow, to conform, to make small compromises that seem harmless until they become total. Refusal is dangerous, and yet the narratives portray refusal as possible. They speak of faith as something that can exist inside power without being owned by it. In this atmosphere, visions multiply. Apocalyptic imagery begins to sharpen. Beasts, thrones, heavenly courts, cosmic verdicts. These are not fantasies invented for entertainment. They are a language of oppressed and disoriented communities trying to say what ordinary speech cannot say. That empires feel monstrous, that history can look like an endless parade of predators, and that justice must exist somewhere beyond the reach of imperial propaganda. The visions place the real struggle in a realm larger than the visible one, not to encourage escapism, but to protect hope from being crushed by the evidence of the present. Then the political weather changes again, as it always does. Babylon falls to a new power with a different style: Persia. Where Babylon's image is often that of iron force and humiliation, Persian imperial policy in many cases is remembered for administrative pragmatism, local governance, and controlled tolerance. The biblical tradition frames the shift as an opening. An exiled people is given permission to return and rebuild. Return, however, is not a simple homecoming. It is not a clean reversal of exile. It is a collision between memory and reality. The journey back to Judah reveals a land that has not waited intact. Fields have been claimed. Towns have changed. People who remained have their own stories of survival. Those who return carry a sacred nostalgia shaped by songs and grief, and nostalgia can be as dangerous as despair because it expects the past to be recoverable without cost. The first priority becomes rebuilding a sacred center. An altar is re-established. Sacrifice resumes. A foundation is laid for a new temple. The tradition preserves a moment of mixed emotion. Some rejoice, some weep. Those who remember the old sanctuary feel the difference in their bones. The new structure is smaller, poorer, less impressive. Yet the question beneath their tears is larger than architecture. Will divine presence return, and will the community be capable of becoming what it claims to be? Prophetic voices rise again in this era, urging the people to build, to persist, to refuse paralysis. Yet the prophets are not merely cheerleaders. They press the deeper issue. Rebuilding stones without rebuilding justice creates a hollow shrine. The message remains consistent across centuries. Sacred space is not a guarantee. It is a responsibility. When the temple is completed, the community is still fragile. The real rebuilding must happen in people, in courts, in marriage contracts, in land policies, in the daily ethics of neighbor life. This is where another kind of struggle begins, less dramatic than siege, but just as defining: the struggle over identity boundaries. In a small province under a vast empire, a community feels perpetually threatened by absorption. Intermarriage becomes an anxiety point, not necessarily because foreigners are treated as less human, but because religious assimilation often travels through household life. Gods arrive through spouses, through festivals, through the private rituals that shape children before they ever step into public worship. The texts reflect a fear that the covenant will dissolve quietly, not through violence, but through forgetfulness. Leaders emerge as reformers: scribes, administrators, builders. They organize walls, enforce policies, and read the law aloud to the people as a public event. The public reading matters. It treats Scripture not as a private possession of elites, but as the shared constitution of a community. The people weep and celebrate, hearing the words as both indictment and promise. The act suggests that the true center of Israel after exile is not only a building. It is a story, a covenant memory, a law interpreted as a way to stay human in a world that trains people to become tools. Yet the renewed community remains haunted by inequality. Wealthy landowners can exploit poorer farmers through debt. Officials can become corrupt. Priests can become complacent. The prophetic critiques continue, warning that the rebuilt temple means nothing if worship is paired with oppression. The tradition keeps returning to the same ethical baseline. The measure of faithfulness is seen most clearly in the treatment of the vulnerable. Over time, the social landscape changes further. Empires shift hands again. The Persian era gives way to Greek rule, and with Greek rule comes a different kind of pressure. Not only political control, but cultural prestige. Greek language becomes a tool of administration and opportunity. Greek education becomes a gateway to status. Greek civic life, with its public rituals and honor codes, becomes a magnet for elites. A major transformation unfolds quietly but profoundly. Jewish communities begin to live across a wider world in more permanent diasporas. Some remain in Judea. Many live in cities where the temple is distant, where daily life is threaded through foreign customs. This produces new forms of adaptation. Scriptures are translated into Greek for communities that no longer speak Hebrew or Aramaic with ease. Interpretation becomes a form of survival. Questions multiply. How to keep covenant in a city filled with other gods? How to remain distinct without becoming isolated? How to honor ancestral law while navigating economies and institutions shaped by imperial culture? The pressures are not uniform. In some places, coexistence is workable. In others, conflict sharpens. Judea becomes a site where identity politics and imperial policy collide. At a certain point, the tension becomes violent. Rulers attempt to standardize religious practice, and the temple becomes the contested symbol. When sacred space is forced into conformity, resistance becomes more than political. It becomes a fight over the right to worship, the right to keep the covenant in the body and in the calendar. The tradition remembers a period where sacrilege is enacted publicly and law-observant life is treated as criminal. In response, revolt ignites. The rebellion that follows is remembered as both national struggle and religious crisis. It is a time of guerrilla warfare, family loyalty tested under terror, and the emergence of leaders who see themselves as defending the covenant with blood. The rededication of the temple becomes a lasting memory of defiance and restoration. But the aftermath does not produce a simple moral victory. It produces new rulers, new compromises, and new debates over what faithfulness looks like when the community holds political power again. Out of these centuries emerges a landscape of competing interpretations. Some groups emphasize priestly authority and temple stability, aligned with the rhythms of sacrifice and a certain degree of accommodation to the powers that be. Some emphasize rigorous legal interpretation, building a way of life where holiness is carried into every meal, every marketplace interaction, every household decision. Some withdraw toward the desert, convinced that the temple leadership has become corrupt and that the true covenant community must be purified through separation, strict discipline, and an intensified expectation of divine intervention. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become an archaeological window into the era's spiritual weather. They reveal a community shaped by scripture, law, communal rules, and apocalyptic hope. People who believed they were living in the last days of a corrupt age, awaiting a decisive act of God. They show interpretive practices, hymns, and a worldview where cosmic conflict is not metaphor, but the underlying reality of history. Alongside these movements, older traditions are reread and expanded. Stories about heavenly beings, watchers, and hidden knowledge circulate in Jewish literature and shape imagination. Texts like 1 Enoch wrestle with the origin of evil not merely as individual failure, but as a fracture with cosmic dimensions. Jubilees retells ancestral history with heightened attention to calendar, purity, and the boundaries that define identity. Other writings explore angels and demons, wisdom and judgment, the fate of the dead, and the hope of resurrection. These developments do not replace Scripture. They orbit it, interpret it, argue with it, intensify its themes. They reveal a community thinking under pressure, trying to understand why the righteous suffer, why empires thrive, why God seems hidden, and how hope can remain rational when the world looks like it rewards cruelty. By the time the late Second Temple era matures, Judea is a land saturated with expectation. The temple stands again, but it stands in a world of soldiers and taxes, alliances and betrayals, priests and factions. People debate purity with urgency because purity has become a language for survival. People debate law because law is now the portable homeland. People debate the coming of a Messiah because the present feels intolerably incomplete, and because the prophetic promises refuse to die. In homes lit by small lamps, families tell old stories of Exodus and covenant. In marketplaces, teachers argue over the meaning of commandments and the boundaries of mercy. In wilderness places, communities copy scriptures and prepare for a final confrontation they believe is near. In cities, diaspora Jews navigate the prestige and seduction of the Greek world while translating their ancestral faith into new language. The Bible's story has moved from kings and temples to something both subtler and more explosive. A people whose hope has become sharpened by centuries of loss, whose faith has learned to survive without guarantees, and whose world is now crowded with questions that demand an answer, not only from scholars and priests, but from history itself. By the late Second Temple era, the land feels crowded even when the hills are empty. Jerusalem sits on its ridges like a nerve exposed to weather. Pilgrims climb toward it, with dust on their robes and prayer on their lips, carrying coins for offerings, carrying questions that have been growing heavier for generations. The temple still stands as the most visible symbol of covenant life, yet it stands under foreign oversight. Soldiers patrol roads, taxes flow outward, local elites negotiate with imperial authority. The city's holiness and its political vulnerability are pressed together so tightly they begin to spark. To understand this period, it helps to stop imagining religion as a separate compartment. In Judea, worship is economy, purity is social boundary, law is identity, calendar is resistance, and behind all of it is an ache, the sense that history is unfinished, that the promises spoken by prophets still hang in the air like smoke that will not dissipate. The temple itself is not only a place of prayer, it is a system. Animals must be inspected, exchanged, purchased. Money must be converted into acceptable coinage. Priests manage schedules, offerings, and the flow of crowds. The city's holiness is therefore also a rhythm of labor and trade. Archaeology and texts together suggest a world where ritual immersion pools are common, where stone vessels are preferred by those anxious about impurity, where burial customs reflect evolving beliefs about the body and the hope of restoration. Even ordinary people are trained to think in categories of clean and unclean, not because they love rules for their own sake, but because holiness has become a daily form of survival. Yet holiness does not mean uniformity. Different groups argue over what faithfulness truly demands. Some emphasize priestly authority and the temple's central role, guarding tradition with a seriousness that can harden into exclusivity. Others build a more portable sanctity, intensifying the law in daily life, so that holiness does not depend on one building, one priesthood, one political arrangement. Teachers debate how to interpret commandments, how to apply ancient words to new pressures, how to keep mercy from being swallowed by rigor, and how to keep rigor from being swallowed by compromise. On the margins, some withdraw toward wilderness spaces, convinced that the official leadership has become contaminated by politics and wealth. Their communities are disciplined and text-saturated. They copy, interpret, and reorder scripture with the conviction that their own age is the climax of a long conflict. Their language is full of battle imagery, light against darkness, truth against deception, the faithful remnant against a world that has allied itself with corruption. In their imagination, history is not merely politics. It is spiritual warfare wearing political clothing. This is also the period when the unseen world becomes sharply articulated. The Bible's earliest layers speak of the divine counsel, messengers, adversaries, and the reality of evil. But the late Second Temple literature builds a more detailed architecture of the invisible. Ancient questions become unbearable in a world where empires keep rising and righteousness keeps bleeding. If the Creator rules, why does evil endure? If covenant is real, why do the violent prosper? If God is just, why do the faithful die at the hands of the arrogant? Some texts answer by widening the stage. They describe rebellious heavenly beings and the spread of forbidden knowledge, not as a curiosity, but as a way of saying that evil is not only a personal choice, it is a contamination in the world's systems. The Watcher's tradition, remembered with particular intensity in Jewish apocalyptic writing, frames violence as something taught, cultivated, transmitted. It explains the human hunger for domination as an infection that did not begin solely inside the human heart, even while never removing human responsibility. Evil becomes both internal and atmospheric. Alongside this, the language of demonic oppression grows more concrete. Unclean spirits, afflicting presences, and hostile powers are described with an urgency that sounds less like folklore and more like lived experience in a world where medicine is limited and trauma is common. The lines between physical suffering, psychological torment, and spiritual attack are not drawn with modern precision. People describe what they see: seizures, madness, despair, compulsions that feel alien. In such a context, the idea of liberation is not abstract. It is intensely practical. Exorcism and purification are therefore not fringe concerns. They belong to a broader worldview in which holiness repels impurity the way light repels darkness. This is why prayers, names, psalms, and ritual actions become weapons in the cultural imagination. Some writings even reflect fascination with the authority of sacred names and the ordering of spirits, not to turn God into a tool, but to express a belief that the world is structured and that evil can be resisted. At the same time, the afterlife becomes a central debate. Older layers of Israel's scripture speak of the dead in a shadowed realm, a place of silence and distance. Later writings, shaped by persecution and hope, press toward resurrection. If the righteous are crushed, then justice cannot be limited to this life. If martyrs die for faithfulness, then the covenant must have a horizon beyond the grave. Resurrection is not merely comfort. It is moral logic. It declares that history is accountable, that death does not erase the record, that divine justice cannot be bribed by the finality of the tomb. This debate matters because it reveals the era's emotional temperature. People are not arguing about abstract metaphysics. They are arguing because the present world feels too cruel to be the full story. Messianic expectation, too, is not a single concept. It is a cluster of hopes. Some expect a royal figure in the line of David, a leader who will restore sovereignty and crush foreign domination. Some imagine a priestly purifier who will cleanse worship and repair the covenant from within. Some expect a prophetic voice like Moses, a teacher who will reawaken the people to the true meaning of the law. Some apocalyptic visions speak of a human-like figure enthroned by the Ancient of Days, a symbol of vindication that looks like both judgment and mercy. These hopes overlap, compete, and sometimes fuse, because the community is trying to describe an answer big enough for centuries of disappointment. All of this unfolds under an imperial order that is both disciplined and humiliating. Rome does not need to destroy the temple to control the land. It only needs to control the flow of money and the appointment of leaders. Local kings and governors balance brutality with pragmatism. Public peace is maintained, but it is the peace of surveillance. Rebellion is punished. Banditry and insurgency rise in the countryside. In cities, collaboration becomes a path to stability and wealth, while in villages, resentment becomes a slow-burning fire passed down in stories. In such a world, purity is not only ritual, it is political. To keep oneself separate from impurity can also mean to keep oneself separate from assimilation. To insist on Sabbath rest can also mean to refuse imperial time. To refuse certain foods can also mean to refuse the empire's table. Even the act of pilgrimage can be interpreted as a kind of national memory march, a reenactment of belonging in a land where belonging is contested. Jerusalem, therefore, becomes more than a city. It becomes a pressure chamber. Pilgrimage festivals swell the population. Songs rise in the streets. The scent of sacrifice drifts across stone. Teachers gather listeners in courtyards. Debates sharpen. Rumors spread quickly because hope is contagious and danger is near. Soldiers watch crowds the way a person watches a dry forest for sparks. The priestly leadership tries to keep the machine running because a malfunction could become a riot, and a riot could become massacre. In the midst of this, A particular kind of religious hunger grows, the hunger for authority that is not compromised. People have seen priests negotiate with power. They have seen rulers build monuments with one hand and demand loyalty with the other. They have seen law used as a badge rather than a cure. They have seen spiritual language used to anesthetize guilt and justify cruelty. They want something true enough to survive collision with reality. This hunger explains why the era produces so many teachers, reformers, visionaries, and would-be deliverers. Some gather disciples in the wilderness. Some call the people back to covenant ethics with a voice sharp as flint. Some promise signs. Some promise swords. Some promise both. The land becomes a place where the boundary between faith and revolution is constantly tested. The unseen world in this atmosphere is not an exotic add-on. It is the era's way of naming what cannot be solved by policy alone. When oppression feels larger than any one ruler, it is described as a power. When temptation feels stronger than ordinary desire, it is described as an adversary. When communities fracture, it is described as deception. When hope persists against evidence, it is described as divine faithfulness. Angels and demons become a vocabulary for the moral reality people sense behind the visible stage. And the Bible's story, having traveled through creation and flood, covenant and exodus, kings and collapse, temple and exile, now enters an age where everything is intensified. Law becomes more detailed because identity is threatened. Prayer becomes more urgent because sovereignty is absent. Hope becomes sharper because history feels cornered. The land is alive with expectation, and the air itself seems to vibrate with one question that no empire can silence. If God truly reigns, what will that reign look like in a world that has made itself comfortable with chains? In the 1st century, Judea lives with two calendars at once. One is the sacred calendar, Sabbaths, pilgrim feasts, fast days, purification rhythms, the steady pulse of Scripture read aloud and interpreted in synagogues and households. The other is the imperial calendar, taxes due, decrees issued, soldiers moving through streets, loyalty measured in quiet gestures. Between these two clocks, ordinary people try to build ordinary lives, marriages, births, harvests, business deals, while carrying a collective memory that refuses to accept Rome as the final author of history. The temple remains the visible heart of the land's religious imagination. Pilgrims come up to it for festivals, singing psalms and carrying offerings. Priests manage the system. The city's economy swells and tightens with each season. Yet the temple is also a political symbol, watched by authorities who understand that crowds and hope can turn dangerous quickly. Judea is small, but it sits on an old fault line. The conviction that the God of Israel is sovereign, and the daily evidence that empire can still crush bodies. Into this landscape comes a teacher shaped by Galilee's villages, an area marked by agriculture, fishing, and mixed cultural pressures. His public life begins in the orbit of a wilderness renewal movement, where repentance is preached as preparation for divine intervention. The wilderness is never neutral in Israel's memory. It is where slavery was left behind, where covenant was formed, where a people learned dependence. To call the nation into the wilderness again is to suggest that the present moment resembles the old moment before liberation, as if history has circled back and is demanding a decision. The teacher's central proclamation is not simply moral advice, it is an announcement. God's reign is near. That phrase carries political electricity even when spoken in spiritual tones. It implies that the world's current order is temporary, that injustice is not stable, that the present rulers do not own the future. Yet the announcement is delivered in a way that frustrates simple revolutionary expectation. Instead of recruiting an army, he gathers disciples. Instead of seizing buildings, he tells stories. Instead of rewarding the powerful, he blesses the poor, the mourners, the meek, the hungry for justice. The parables are not cute illustrations. They are a method of confrontation. They describe seed and soil, debts and wages, banquets and weddings, vineyards and thieves, ordinary realities turned into moral mirrors. They imply that the real battle is not only against Rome, but against hardened hearts, hypocrisy, and the quiet violence people accept as normal. The stories insist that divine judgment begins as revelation. It exposes what a person loves when no one is watching, what a community protects when its reputation is threatened. His ministry is marked by healings and acts of restoration that carry more than physical meaning. In a culture where illness and impurity can isolate people socially and ritually, healing is reintegration. It is return to community. It is the reopening of doors that have been closed by fear. Accounts of unclean spirits being cast out belong to the era's worldview of invisible conflict, yet they also reflect something deeply human. The sense that evil is not always chosen calmly, that people can feel occupied by compulsions, terrors, and despair that do not respond to ordinary willpower. Liberation, in that setting, is not theory. It is the reassertion of order where chaos has nested. Conflict intensifies as his influence grows, not because all religious leaders are portrayed as villains, but because authority is threatened by unpredictable holiness. In the world of Second Temple Judaism, debates over law are not petty. They are about fidelity, about survival, about how to remain Israel under pressure. When the teacher challenges certain interpretations, especially those that protect status at the expense of mercy, he is not attacking the law's moral core. He is attacking the human tendency to use law as a shield for pride. His harshest words are often reserved for performative piety. Public displays that hide private injustice, meticulous boundary-keeping that forgets the weightier demands of truth and compassion. His table fellowship becomes a flashpoint. Meals in that world are social maps. They mark belonging. They announce purity boundaries. To eat with the disreputable is not merely kindness. It is a refusal to let shame define identity. In these gatherings, forgiveness is spoken like an authority, and that is precisely what alarms many listeners. Forgiveness in Israel's tradition is divine territory. To speak it with confidence sounds either like blasphemy or like an extraordinary claim about who is acting through him. As he moves toward Jerusalem, the tension becomes impossible to ignore. The city at festival time is a volatile mix. Pilgrims, priests, Roman troops, rumors, old prophecies, fresh resentments. Any prophet who speaks of God's reign in that environment is standing near dry tinder. His actions in the temple precincts, especially any public disruption connected to commerce and the integrity of worship, are remembered as a decisive provocation. Whether one emphasizes religious offense, political risk, or both, the result is the same. He becomes a target not only for criticism, but for removal. The arrest narratives preserve the atmosphere of the moment. Nighttime urgency, betrayal within the inner circle, disciples scattering in fear, authorities seeking control before crowds can react. Trials unfold in overlapping arenas. Religious leadership concerned with blasphemy and stability. Roman governance concerned with sedition and public order. Crucifixion is the empire's language, a punishment designed not only to kill but to humiliate. to display what happens to those who challenge the state's peace. His death is therefore not an accidental tragedy on the edge of history. It is a collision between proclamation and power. Yet what follows is the turning point that births the movement. His followers insist he rose. Resurrection in this context is not a vague idea of the soul living on. Many Jews of the period who hoped for resurrection meant a future bodily vindication, the reversal of death as an act of divine justice. To claim that resurrection has begun with one executed man is to claim that the age has shifted beneath everyone's feet. It implies that the verdict of Rome is not ultimate. It implies that the shame the empire imposed has been overturned by God. It implies that the kingdom proclaimed in parables has erupted into reality in a way no one expected. The earliest Christian preaching preserved in tradition centers on this claim, not as a philosophical abstraction, but as testimony. Appearances, meals, recognition, fear transformed into courage. The conviction spreads that his death must be interpreted through Israel's scriptures, through the language of suffering righteous servants, through covenant themes of sacrifice and redemption, through the pattern of deliverance that runs from Exodus onward. The cross becomes, for them, not a contradiction of God's power, but a revelation of God's character. Victory achieved not by dominating enemies, but by absorbing violence without becoming violence. This does not erase ambiguity or grief. Early communities still bury their dead. They still face uncertainty. But their worship now carries a startling confidence that history has a new axis. The movement grows first within Jewish space. It remains deeply anchored in Israel's story, scriptures, and practices, even as it reinterprets them around the risen Christ. In Jerusalem and beyond, gatherings form marked by shared meals, prayers, and a radical social ethic. Generosity toward the poor, care for widows, the inclusion of outsiders, a refusal to treat wealth as proof of divine favor. The community's internal disputes reveal its humanity. Cultural fault lines appear between Aramaic-speaking and Greek-speaking Jews, between those shaped by Judea's local rhythms and those shaped by diaspora cities. Persecution emerges, sometimes driven by local religious conflict, sometimes by political suspicion, sometimes by the simple fact that a movement claiming an alternative lordship unsettles every system that demands ultimate allegiance. Stories preserve martyrs not as people seeking death, but as people who refuse to lie about what they believe they have seen. One of the most consequential figures in the spread of the movement is a former persecutor who becomes a missionary and theologian. His letters, written to communities across the Eastern Mediterranean, reveal Christianity in its raw, early form. Arguments, pastoral warnings, ethical instruction, and deep reflection on how the God of Israel is now drawing in the nations without requiring them to become Jews in the full cultural sense. The debates are intense because the stakes are enormous. If Gentiles join, what happens to circumcision, dietary boundaries, and calendar markers? What defines belonging now? The earliest answer that emerges is not a rejection of Israel's story, but an expansion of it. The claim is that Gentiles are being grafted into the covenant family through faith in the Messiah, not through ethnic conversion. This creates a new kind of community that is both thrilling and fragile. Jews and Gentiles sharing meals, worshiping the God of Israel together, trying to learn a mutual ethic of humility. Social hierarchies are challenged, though never erased overnight. In a world where status is life, the insistence that there is neither privileged nor disposable within the Messiah's community becomes a quiet revolution. These communities are not formed in safe spaces. They are formed in port cities and trade hubs filled with temples, patronage networks, and imperial images. To confess that Jesus is Lord is not merely devotional language. It competes with the empire's demand for ultimate loyalty. The communities therefore develop a moral distinctiveness that is not merely rule-keeping. They reject sexual exploitation as normal. They resist the casual exposure of infants. They promote care for the sick and the poor. They encourage marriage faithfulness and mutual responsibility. They form alternative social bonds that can look suspicious to outsiders precisely because they weaken the old control systems of honor, patronage, and fear. As time passes, the movement's relationship with mainstream Judaism becomes more strained, shaped by theological dispute and by the brutal pressures of history. The land itself moves toward catastrophe. Revolt against Rome ignites, conflict escalates, and the resulting devastation tears through Jerusalem. The temple's destruction becomes a second earthquake in Jewish memory, echoing the Babylonian trauma and forcing another transformation of identity. For Christians, this event is interpreted through their conviction that God's presence is no longer centered in one building, and that the Messiah himself has become the meeting point between heaven and earth. For Jews, the disaster deepens the work of preserving faith through Torah, prayer, and communal life without sacrifice. The wounds are shared, but the interpretations diverge. Within Christianity, diversity of expression grows. Different communities preserve memories of Jesus in distinct narrative forms. Gospels are composed, shaped by oral tradition, scripture, and the needs of communities facing persecution, confusion, and ethical challenge. These texts present Jesus not only as teacher and healer, but as the culmination of Israel's hope. Davidic heir, suffering servant, new Moses, divine wisdom embodied. They do not read like detached biographies. They read like proclamation in narrative form, insisting that in this life, death, and rising, God has acted decisively. Yet the movement remains marked by tension between the already and the not yet. Followers believe the kingdom has begun, yet the world still bleeds. They claim that evil has been judged, yet oppression still rules streets and courts. They speak of new creation, yet they still bury children and face hunger and betrayal. This tension does not dissolve their faith. It becomes part of it. Hope becomes a discipline. Prayer becomes endurance. Ethics becomes witness. By the end of this period, Christianity is no longer a local renewal movement on Judaism's margins. It has become a spreading network of communities bound by scripture, meals, baptismal identity, and the confession that the crucified one is alive and exalted. It is a faith that insists the Creator has entered human suffering rather than watching it from a distance, and that the ultimate measure of power is not the ability to crush enemies, but the ability to raise the dead and remake the world without becoming the thing that ruined it. The Bible ends the way it began, with a world that looks unstable, and with a claim that meaning is not a fragile human invention. By the late 1st century, the early Christian communities are scattered across cities and ports, villages and trade routes, living inside an empire that prizes order, honor, and visible loyalty. Their gatherings are small. Their social power is limited. Their public reputation is mixed. Some neighbors see them as strange, even dangerous, people who refuse to worship the gods that supposedly hold the city together, people who will not burn incense as a gesture of civic belonging. To Rome, the line between religion and politics is thin. A refusal to participate in the empire's sacred language can be interpreted as disloyalty. Persecution is therefore not always constant, but it is always possible. Communities learn to live as though the ground beneath them can shift at any time. The Bible's final writings emerge from this pressure. They are not written to satisfy curiosity. They are written to keep faith alive when fear is practical and compromise looks reasonable. This is where apocalyptic becomes not a puzzle genre, but a survival literature. Apocalyptic language was already present in Jewish tradition. Visions of beasts and thrones, cosmic courts, hidden books, and divine verdicts. Early Christians inherit this vocabulary and intensify it around their conviction that Jesus is the risen and reigning Messiah. The result is a set of images that do not function like newspaper predictions. They function like moral X-rays. They reveal what empires are beneath their polished speeches. They show spiritual realities behind political events. They insist that history has accountability, even when courts are corrupt. In the Bible's final apocalypse, Rome is never named directly in the most symbolic passages, but the imagery speaks in the dialect of the era. The beast evokes imperial power that demands worship. The seductive city evokes wealth and violence entwined, commerce built on exploitation, luxury stained by blood. The point is not that one ancient empire was uniquely evil. The point is that empire, as a human system, tends to become a spiritual temptation. It offers peace in exchange for conscience. It offers prosperity in exchange for truth. It offers belonging in exchange for worship. The text refuses the bargain. It portrays the world as contested by rival allegiances, and it forces the listener to face a question the Bible has been asking since Eden. What do you trust when you are afraid? In a society where public honor can be bought by small acts of compromise, the insistence on faithful witness becomes a form of resistance. The martyrs in this tradition are not presented as people who love pain. They are people who refuse to let fear dictate reality. Their suffering becomes testimony that the empire's verdict is not the final verdict. The apocalypse also preserves something else that can be missed in its thunder: worship. Songs rise constantly through its pages. Worship is not decorative. It is how the text reorders the reader's imagination. Empires train people to look up at palaces and down at the poor. Apocalyptic worship trains people to look up at the throne of God and therefore to see palaces as temporary. It trains people to see the slaughtered lamb as the true center of history, which is a paradox meant to crush the instinct to equate power with violence. The lamb reigns not by becoming a beast, but by refusing the beast's methods. This is the Bible's most shocking political theology. Ultimate authority is morally pure, and the shape of victory is self-giving rather than domination. Judgment in these final texts is portrayed with severity, and it should not be softened into sentimentality. The Bible does not end by pretending evil is harmless. It insists that evil is real enough to require final reckoning. Yet the aim is not cosmic cruelty. The aim is moral repair. The images of courts, books, and verdicts are meant to say that nothing is forgotten. The exploited are remembered. The silenced are remembered. The hidden violence that never reached a human courtroom still reaches a divine one. And then the Bible turns toward its final horizon: new creation. This is not presented as an escape from earth, but as earth made whole. The final vision is bodily, material, and communal. A city descends rather than people floating away. The language is saturated with temple imagery: gates, precious stones, sacred light. Yet it also includes a stunning reversal. There is no temple building, because the presence that once required layered access has become the environment of everything. The sacred center has expanded until it fills all. The river of life appears, echoing Eden. A tree stands again, but now it is not a boundary of dread. It is a source of healing. The curse language that haunted the early chapters is answered not with denial, but with reversal. Death, the great humiliator, is named as an enemy that will not endure. Tears are not dismissed as weakness. They are acknowledged and wiped away, not by human courage, but by divine tenderness. This is where the Bible's long arc reveals its shape. Creation began as order offered. Humanity fractured the order through distrust. Violence spread through families and societies. God called a family and formed a people. That people was rescued from oppression, given a law meant to restrain predation, and warned repeatedly that worship without justice is false. Kings rose and corrupted. Prophets spoke and were ignored. Cities burned. Exile scattered the faithful. Yet the covenant survived, not because humans were consistent, but because divine commitment did not expire. In the fullness of time, according to the New Testament, the story's center comes not as a conqueror in armor, but as a suffering Messiah whose death is interpreted as the absorbing of violence and the opening of forgiveness. His resurrection is proclaimed as the first crack in the wall of death, the beginning of a new creation inside the old. The church emerges as a community that is meant to preview that new creation, imperfectly, often painfully, yet with a distinctive ethic that tries to align daily life with the reign it confesses. The Bible, therefore, does not end by tying every thread into a tidy bow. It ends by demanding allegiance. It asks whether you will trust the beastly logic of history, power, fear, consumption, domination, or the Lamb's logic, truth, endurance, mercy, holiness. It asks whether you will treat Scripture as a weapon for self-importance or as a mirror that exposes your loves. It asks whether you will build your life around what seems immediately strong or around what is ultimately true. In academic terms, the Bible is a library. Law codes and poems, royal chronicles and prophecies, gospels and letters, apocalyptic visions, texts formed over centuries, preserved through trauma, interpreted across cultures, and studied with debate that continues to this day. Archaeology illuminates settings and sometimes complicates simple readings. Ancient Near Eastern parallels clarify what the Bible is doing rhetorically and theologically. Second Temple literature shows the imagination of the era in which the New Testament emerged. Early Christian writings reveal how quickly interpretation, ethics, and communal structure developed under pressure. But even when approached as a historical library, the Bible's internal voice remains consistent in its central claims. It insists that the world has moral meaning. It insists that humans are both dignified and dangerous. It insists that power must be restrained by justice. It insists that worship without mercy is empty. It insists that suffering is not invisible. It insists that evil will not be eternal. It insists that hope is not a childish refusal to see darkness, but a decision to believe that darkness is not the last word. The Bible ends with a city of light, but it reaches that light through deserts, wars, betrayals, exile, and crosses. It does not offer a shallow optimism. It offers a long, costly hope, one that claims the Creator has not abandoned creation, and that the final shape of reality will not be a throne built on fear, but a world made whole.